Boa tarde a todas, todos e todes. Meu nome é Isabela Rigeli. Eu vou fazer a mediação da última comunicação do dia. Eu gostaria de apresentar a Mar Safor. Ela é artista, organizadora e educadora, nascida e criada em Richmond, Virgínia, Estados Unidos. Em 2017, tornou-se mestre em Belas Artes pela Steinhardt da Universidade de Nova York. Sua prática de arte multimídia mistura a linha entre arte e cultura, o político e o pessoal, e o público e o privado, por meio de vídeo, performance e instalação. Safor é integrante do coletivo MTL+, um grupo de artistas, escritores e educadores que combinam pesquisa estética com ação política. O MTL Plus fundou e facilita o Decolonize Displays, traduzindo como Descoloniza este lugar, colaboração entre produtores culturais e organizadores políticos que compartilham lutas e fronteiras. A artista iniciou recentemente seu segundo ano de doutorado no Departamento de Mídia, Cultura e Comunicação da Steinhardt. Eu só gostaria de dar, antes de chamar Mars aqui no palco, eu gostaria apenas de dar lembrá-los de escrever as perguntas para a comunicadora, depois e entregar para as pessoas que estão em volta do palco. E eu também gostaria de lembrar que nós temos que encerrar às 5h30, então meia hora de comunicação, mais meia hora para debate, discussão, e depois nós vamos encerrar, mas as discussões sempre podem continuar lá fora, no hall do museu. E é isso, eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a Mar Safor. Obrigada.
Good afternoon. My name is Mars, and I'm excited to be here in Sao Paulo with you guys. Shout out to MASP and Afterall for inviting me here from New York City. Super pumped. Today I'm going to spend some time talking about the work of a movement I'm involved in called Decolonize This Place, or DTP for short. And we're based in New York City. Specifically, I'm going to provide a chronological narrative of DTP, focusing on decolonizing our institutions, as well as our cities. So we can get started. I think it's important to talk about the failures that brought us to the point in which we are today. Without failure, there is no growth, so I kind of really love thinking of failure in this narrative. So first, I turn to the failures of Occupy Wall Street, which was a rupture in which many of our comrades in DTP were key organizers. The main failure of Occupy Wall Street, right, is that it perpetuated a lot of the systemic oppression that it sought to dismantle. First off, the name Occupy Wall Street is problematic because Wall Street is already on indigenous lands. Next, although people of color were core organizers of Occupy Wall Street, their presence was often erased in the media, which operates as an extension of the state. Patriarchy and sexualized violence also ran its course in Zuccotti Park, as women were still being raped in this utopic, reimagined society. Overall, Occupy Wall Street failed to put a settler colonial, gender, and race analysis into practice. The question became, what does it truly look like to stand in solidarity with indigenous peoples? What does it look like to stand in solidarity with Black people, with trans women, with sex workers, with all oppressed peoples? How does this solidarity transcend struggles, borders, and nation states? In the spirit of the Zapatistas, how do we walk separately and together towards collective liberation? Early 2014, folks began thinking about how to stand in solidarity with Palestine from New York City during the war on Gaza. A new formation was created to answer this call called Direct Action Front for Palestine. Questions were, how does solidarity amplify the struggles on the ground to counter biased media narratives, which paint colonized peoples as the aggressor? This action attempts to do that. On the left, a public march featured a sea of Palestinian flags moving together across the Brooklyn Bridge. Meanwhile, on the right, we have a photo from the Manhattan Bridge, where a tightly knit affinity group dropped a 90-foot banner off of the bridge reading, Gaza in our hearts, boycott, divest, sanction, or otherwise known as BDS. This secretly planned banner drop forced the media to not only report on such a badass aesthetic feat, and here it's important to note that this action was illegal, but to state and explain BDS while doing so, forcing the media's hand to talk about what BDS is. Even if the media outlets wanted to glaze over the particularities of the march, as they tend to do to simplify and delegitimize political action, this banner drop foregrounded the particularities of Palestine in such a way that it was impossible to circumvent by media outlets. Additionally, in summer 2014, Mike Brown, a Black man, was murdered by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, which revitalized the Black Lives Matter movement. How is Black liberation tied to Palestinian liberation? How might solidarity look between Black peoples and Palestinians? One connection between what's happening in Gaza and Palestine and what's happening in Ferguson in the US is the use of state violence against colonized peoples. This connection was made concrete that summer as Palestinians tweeted Ferguson activists with tips on how to defend oneself against tear gas. And I'll actually be returning to the topic of tear gas a little later when discussing our organizing work around the Whitney Museum. This image features activist Edward Crawford Jr. throwing a tear gas canister back at police. He mysteriously died in 2017. Like the deaths of a handful of other Ferguson activists, people believe his death is a part of something larger. This image features one of the 12 banners painted fall 2014 linking Black and Palestinian liberation. 11 banners read, "Black Lives Matter," and one reads, "When we breathe together." All 12 featured a painted keffiyeh pattern on one side, a Palestinian sign of resistance and steadfastness. This series of banners was painted in memory of Eric Garner, another Black man murdered by police. Fast forward to May Day 2016 to another formation called Decolonial Cultural Front, one of the core organizers of an action involved in the action against the Brooklyn Museum in reference to two exhibitions they had on display. Here we will see the official adoption of decolonization as the framework for our work. We wondered, what can a decolonial framework bring to such an intensely colonial space as a museum, if anything? And more importantly, what can that framework do for our movements? The first exhibition was called This Place. Thus, the action was called Decolonize This Place. This Place is a $6 million photography exhibition featuring the work of 12 of the world's top fine art photographers, such as Stephen Shore and Jeff Wall. These artists were tasked with visiting Palestine and capturing the conflict through an objective photographic lens. However, the exhibition proved to be biased as it flaunts beautiful, high-resolution landscape photographs without mentioning the Israeli occupation, as it displays portraits of Palestinians and Israeli settlers without highlighting the power dynamics between the two groups, and how it references only the Hebrew names of Palestinian geographical sites and landmarks, completely omitting the Arabic names. This place erases or art washes the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Next door to this place was an exhibition called Agitprop, which featured contemporary protest art and other materials created for social movements. A Brooklyn-based anti-gentrification group called Movement to Protect the People, also known as MTOP, protested the Brooklyn Museum for hosting the 2016 Brooklyn Real Estate Summit, which directly implicated the museum in the development and the gentrification of Brooklyn. The museum's response was simple: just include MTOP in the Agitprop exhibition. Museums and institutions have a history of absorbing social movements as a way to contain and limit their political power. However, that wasn't the last time the Brooklyn Museum saw MTOP. There were two stages set for the direct action in the museum that day. One took place in this place. We held an assembly in the exhibition, highlighting the show's erasure of Palestine and Palestinian resistance. Then we mic checked the Arabic names of the Palestinian geographic locations to counter the Hebrew naming. Concurrently, an action took place in Agitprop, where through another series of mic checks, members of MTOP highlighted the museum's role in the displacement and dispossession of Black people in the neighborhood. Importantly, there was a concrete connection made between the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples in Palestine and the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. Gentrification is a part of the ongoing process of settler colonization. In this way, the struggle for land and liberation connects indigenous struggles in the US and Palestine as both Israel and the US engage in settler colonial projects. I think it's an important point to pause, like many of the folks did before me, to really contextualize what I mean by decolonization. And also, like folks before me, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang is a principal text that we use at Decolonize This Place. Although this quote is quite lengthy, I think it's important to read it in its entirety to really get at what the work that we're trying to do. Not unique, the United States as a settler colonial nation state also operates as empire, utilizing external forms and internal forms of colonization simultaneous to the settler colonial project. This means, and this is perplexing to some, that dispossessed people are brought onto seized indigenous land through other colonial projects. Other colonial projects include enslavement, as discussed, but also military recruitment, low-wage and high-wage labor recruitment, such as agricultural workers and overseas trained engineers, and displacement migration, such as the coerced immigration from nations torn by US wars or devastated by US economic policy. In this set of settler-colonial relations, colonial subjects who are displaced by external colonialism, as well as racialized and minoritized by internal colonialism, are still occupying and settle stolen indigenous land. Settlers are diverse, not just of white European descent, and include people of color, even from other colonial contexts. This tightly wound set of conditions and racialized, globalized relations exponentially complicates what it is meant by decolonization and by solidarity against settler colonial forces. So when we say decolonization, we necessarily refer to the land, the water, and the air of the place in which we stand, and we organize from the positions we inhabit in this really dense matrix of settler colonization. In fall 2016, we were offered a 3-month residency at Artist Space Gallery in downtown Manhattan. As opposed to holding a normal exhibition, we decided to transform the space into a temporary action-oriented movement space. We named the movement Decolonize This Place as both a nod to the Brooklyn Museum action, but to also think through what it means to decolonize as a verb, as a process. Right? We know that settler colonization is not an event, it's a structure. So decolonization is also a process that happens over time. So what does that look like? Thinking through the multiple struggles outlined in the Tuck and Yang article, as well as the strategic intersections emerging in our movements in our city, we opened with 5 different strands of struggle. Indigenous struggles, Black liberation, free Palestine, degentrification, and global wage workers. This list has since grown to include dismantling patriarchy. We hosted organizing meetings, town halls, parties, concerts, film screenings, production parties, or really anything our movements and our cultures of resistance needed to sustain itself and build power. Although you see the banners hanging on the wall in these photos, this was not simply an art move. We hung the banners on the walls for 2 reasons. 1, the banners set forth our politics outright for those who were visiting the space for the first time. 2, like a library, banners need to be both organized and easily accessible to be taken into the streets. So many groups in and outside of New York City use the banner library for various actions from Standing Rock to Puerto Rico to Palestine. Our first major action plan in that space took place at the American Museum of Natural History, otherwise called AMNH. AMNH, like many museums of natural history, operates as a hall of white supremacy. Stranding colonized peoples in the past as collectible objects, rendered docile and inferior by the settler gaze. For the past 4 years, Decolonize This Place and our collaborators have hosted the Anti-Columbus Day Tour at AMNH on Indigenous Peoples Day in October. Each year, we place 3 demands on the museum: rename the day, remove the statue, and respect the ancestors. We ask the museum to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in renaming Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in New York City, as over 55 US cities have already done. We asked the museum to remove the blatantly racist 2-story statue of President Teddy Roosevelt on a stallion, flanked by 2 nearly naked men to indicate their inferior status, one of Indigenous descent and one of African descent. Their heads hang even lower than that of the stallion's head in this racialized hierarchy. Lastly, we asked the museum to respect the ancestors. This demand is open-ended and allows room for imagination. It's also never-ending, just like the process of decolonization. From the most visited collection of the museum consisting of the skulls of the Herero peoples, to the colonial violence inflicted upon the living, sacred, ancestral totems caged in glass cages, we asked the museum to respect and repatriate the ancestors. In past years, groups have taken over entire halls through autonomous actions ranging from alternative mini-tours, calling on the ancestors, blocking the settler gaze from sacred objects, and highlighting the museum's complicity in colonization by exposing its board of trustees and its financial interests. These acts were used as vehicles to discuss present-day issues such as gentrification in New York City, environmental destruction via capitalism and imperialism as seen in Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria, and the ongoing genocide, imprisonment, and sexual abuse faced by indigenous peoples today. This following 2-minute video features some of the scenes from the 3rd Anti-Columbus Day Tour, and the 4th one actually just happened Monday, so I'll return to that at the end of the presentation.
Welcome to the 3rd Anti-Columbus Day Tour, and more.
Let us acknowledge the people of Puerto Rico, a colonial territory of the United States, managed by Roosevelt.
We begin today by acknowledging that we are standing on the homeland of the Lenape, whose land was stolen to create settler states and who continue to live under siege, surveillance, and colonial structural violence.
And this we have to go over some steps so that we are all active, decolonizing, claiming, and in reimagining these halls. We will do this together. Put pressure on the museum. We'll walk separately, we'll walk together.
We'll walk together.
We are the ones that they spoke into the wind, the ones that they gave life to. Hajona Hasklito left. From this point there will be beauty, and all I see is beautiful faces.
And now, Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Hall. Theodore Roosevelt viewed land, territories, animals, and people as objects to be tamed, controlled, and at times destroyed. His corrosive legacy haunts the AMNH from the monument outside to the adoration of his repellent ideals in the museum's rotunda and Roosevelt Memorial Hall.
Colonia, fire, fire, to the colonizer. Fuego, fuego, fuego la colonia.
After we completed our 3-month residency at Artist Space, we continued staging direct actions against museums and other institutions. And it's important to note that this is not as a purity project, but as a way to connect common sites of power and resistance in our city to continue building solidarity across movements. Plus, museums offer a buffer between us and the police state during our actions. Police are only allowed to make an arrest on the institution's private property if the institution itself invites them onto the property to do so. Internationally recognized museums such as AMNH rarely, if ever, welcome the prospect of arrest on their property because it would damage their brand as a progressive, liberal, inclusive space. Additionally, we use museum brands to garner attention for our movements and struggles. When we protest ongoing displacement and dispossession on our street corners, not many people take notice. However, when we do so inside, let's say, the Brooklyn Museum, people start listening. This is a Now This video, which has been played and shared millions of times online. It discusses why we returned to the Brooklyn Museum spring 2018, and it also gives insight into our proposed decolonization commission. You may have heard about the recent controversial hiring of a white woman as the curator of the African art collection at the Brooklyn Museum. Many pointed to the problems of diversity within the museum, but what you probably haven't heard about is the call for the Brooklyn Museum to form a decolonization commission. Remember that museum scene in Black Panther? Killmonger's confronted by a British curator who white-splains the history of an African object that he is looking at. He promptly corrects her by claiming it's actually from the nation of Wakanda, adding,
"How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?"
Well, that scene in Black Panther recently hit a lot closer to home since the film came out. In an open letter, we addressed the hire as just a symptom of a larger structural problem and propose a decolonization commission as an opportunity to the curatorial crisis. The aim of the letter was to redress the ongoing legacies of oppression in which the museum is complicit. The call for decolonization comes from about 20 groups in the city, among which are Decolonize This Place, American Indian Community House, Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network, Movement to Protect the People, and NYC Stands with Standing Rock. So what can a decolonization commission look like? We will have to start from the land that the museum sits on, a territorial acknowledgement that the museum is on the territory of the Lenni Lenape. The Brooklyn Museum holds over 6,000 African artifacts, making it the largest collection of African art in the United States. And while historians are often able to date the objects to very specific times and locations, information about how these objects ended up in the museum is often obscure. So we call for an inventory of all colonial-era objects of both African and indigenous people with the goal of reparations and repatriation. Additionally, we call for an upgrade of working conditions and pay for ground staff, including security, food service, and janitorial divisions, who are largely people of color. The Brooklyn Museum has done some amazing shows like We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, and the current show, Radical Women, Latin American Art. But at the same time, the museum plays the huge role in the gentrification of the neighborhood. So we ask, does it just want the art and not the people? The Brooklyn Museum is by no means alone. The American Museum of Natural History literally has the skulls of African people in their collection. And the Smithsonian owns the remains of the bodies of massacred indigenous people, yet rarely are the histories of slavery and genocide acknowledged in these museums. To be clear, this call to action was never an attack or campaign against the newly appointed white curator of African art, Kristen Wynn-Muller Luna. She may very well be a highly qualified candidate, but her hiring highlights several systemic issues latent in the art world itself. Only 4% of art curators, conservators, educators, and senior museum staff in the US are African American. Surrounding these conversations around diversity in the arts is a long-standing call for people of color to be able to control their own narratives. But let's be honest, the idea of repatriation is fundamentally against the interest of museums and their board members. There's a not-so-accidental link between the history of stolen indigenous artifacts and the damage to communities of color through the gentrification practices those same museums and institutions uphold. And that sentiment begs another question. Who are these museums for? Are they for the surrounding communities that their board members, including real estate tycoon David Berliner, are strategically pushing out? Are they even for the people whose cultures have been systemically stolen from them? As Audre Lorde puts it, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. With the call for a decolonization commission, Decolonize This Place is calling for a radical examination of the foundation and structure of the institution. Radical as in going down to the roots of the United States as a settler colony. The theft of land, labor, and culture over 4 centuries that continues to play out today as gentrification displaces and dispossesses people of color at the doorstep of the museum itself. Will the museum listen to the communities it claims to serve, or will it continue business as usual? Summed up in the banners dropped at last week's action, they want the art, but not the people. So now we turn to the Whitney Museum. A few days after Thanksgiving 2018, an American holiday used as a cover-up for the violent genocide of indigenous peoples, President Trump deployed tear gas against migrant families seeking asylum in the United States at the US-Mexico border. Images of mothers and children being tear gassed at the border went viral. Images of the tear gas canisters also came across our social media news feeds. The tear gas was manufactured by Safariland Group, a US-based, less lethal weapons manufacturer. The CEO of Safariland is Warren B. Kanders. At the time, Kanders was also the vice chairman of the Whitney Museum of American Art. In fact, as an avid collector of Andy Warhol's work, he donated a significant numbers of painting to the Whitney's recent Andy Warhol exhibition entitled Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again, which was on show at the time Trump tear-gassed the migrant families. Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster series performs a critique of state violence, and of course the classic Race Riot 1963 screen print was on display at the Whitney exhibition. So on the one hand, Candace collects anti-state violence art, and on the other hand, he directly participates in the practice of state violence. Shortly after Trump deploys the tear gas, nearly 100 Whitney staff members signed a letter demanding Candace be removed from the board. They also demanded more transparency and accountability from the museum to their employees. In solidarity with the workers, as well as those on the receiving end of Candace tear gas, DTP organized an action against the Whitney Museum in December 2018. During the action, we lit bundles of sage on fire in the lobby of the museum. Our message was clear. Tear gas is bad medicine and sage is good medicine. Until the Whitney engages with good medicine over bad medicine, it will be an enemy of the people. And Warren Candace was just the start of the crisis at the Whitney. From the beginning, we supported the use of a diversity of tactics to be deployed against Candace in the museum by organizers, artists, and everyone in between. Our personal tactic was to launch 9 weeks of Art in Action on March 22nd, 2019, with over 30 collaborating groups and collectives. Throughout the 9 weeks, we presented a narrative from tear gas to decolonization, each week focusing on one way in which the museum is complicit, not just as a harborer of Candace, but as a settler colonial institution at its very roots. Each week, we reclaimed space on the museum's property for our people and our actions as the NYPD surveilled us from the street. Now I'm going to highlight just a few of the 9 weeks in particular. Week 1, we focused on tear gas and other forms of state violence. In addition to the US-Mexico border, Safariland's tear gas is used in Standing Rock, Ferguson, which is where Mike Brown was murdered by Darren Wilson, Palestine, Puerto Rico, Turkey, Egypt, just to name a few places. Safariland also makes other less lethal weapons used heavily in US prisons, by correctional officers, and in our cities by police. In fact, in 2016, the NYPD purchased $7.3 million of weapons and gear from Safariland. Tear gas is a leading weapon deployed against those engaging in freedom struggles across the world. Tear gas has allowed us to see each other, to walk separately and together. Week 3, we delivered an open letter signed by over 100 high-profile art historians, art critics, and writers, demanding the removal of Warren Candace as the starting point to a decolonization process within the museum. This letter was later signed by over 100 artists, including about 50 artists participating in the 2019 Whitney Biennial. Week 5, we centered Palestine. This week was bottom lined by a Palestinian solidarity youth group called Within Our Lifetime. They displayed the photos and names of all the martyrs from the Great Return March, which has been going on every Friday for a year and a half in Gaza. They also performed Dabka, a Palestinian folk dance of resistance. It was also highlighted that Candace not only produces tear gas used in Gaza, but he also produces rubber bullets used against protesters in the Great Return March. Week 6, we centered Puerto Rico. This week was bottom lined by a Bronx-based collective called Comité Boricua en la Diaspora. They held space for a party/speak out inside the museum's lobby. Week 8, we took over a subway train car from East New York, Brooklyn, all the way to the Whitney Museum on the west side of Manhattan. When the museum joined the art hub in the meatpacking district, rent prices skyrocketed in the area, forcing galleries to move to Chinatown, Manhattan. As Chinatown began to overflow with galleries, in fact, Chinatown has over 120 galleries, and it's a very densely populated small neighborhood in New York City, rents increased, and galleries started to move to places like Bushwick, Brooklyn. This process is ongoing and all too familiar for those fighting gentrification in our cities as art moves into beautified, derelict neighborhoods. Our question is who and what is counted as already beautiful, and who and what is counted as derelict or needing to be transformed. Over 10 anti-gentrification and abolition groups joined the liberated train car. Every few stops, a new group boarded the train and held space to discuss the displacement and dispossession in their communities and the subsequent rise of policing. At the end of our ride, we exited the train station and marched to the Whitney, where we met up with the War Resisters Leagues, amongst other groups, who were hosting a speak out on the steps of the museum when we arrived. We went all out for week 9. First, we dropped 4 banners off the facade of the museum reading, "They want the art, not the people," which you will recognize from the Brooklyn Museum action. And also the previously described banner reading, "When we breathe together," not pictured in this image. After briefly speaking inside the museum during the grand opening of the 2019 Whitney Biennial, we masked up and we marched to Warren Kander's house in the West Village at 16 West 12th Street, New York, New York. That night, just in case you find yourself with something to do, that night, to further escalate and force his hand, there we loosely facilitated a speak out in front of his house and spoke to some of his neighbors who, by the way, also hate him. Week 9 took place on May 17th, 2019. On July 24th, 2019, Warren Kanders resigned as vice chairman of the Whitney Museum after a summer of continued pressure from artists and organizers. Although this was a major success for our movements, the celebration was short-lived and bittersweet. We were ready to learn from our failures. From the beginning, we knew the demand to remove Kanders has been both a platform for movement building and a gateway to effect deeper changes in the power relations of art institutions whose business as usual proceedings harm our friends, families, and communities. However, after Warren Kanders' forced resignation from the board of the Whitney, a number of critics and philanthropists came out to debate the significance of his removal. The post-Kanders conversation was being undertaken by the institution, which again seeks to contain and limit the possibilities of political change. Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, and notably, as he describes himself, a black man, a leading funder of social justice projects and reform initiatives in the US, initially praised the efforts of artists, scholars, and organizers, but then backpedaled and stated, "We don't need to demonize wealthy people." His profit over people mentality does not end there. Not even 10 days later, he publishes a statement on the Ford Foundation's blog promoting the city's proposed plan to build 5 new for-profit jails in the boroughs of New York City. This blatantly goes against an ongoing campaign by the New York City chapter of a US national organization called No New Jails. This momentous campaign is calling for the closing of Rikers Island and no new jails on stolen land. Similar to Kanders, Walker finds himself in the middle of a liberal contradiction. On the one hand, he funds social justice projects. On the other hand, he actively uses his influence to hinder social justice from taking place. In fact, the Ford Foundation has a history of doing this even before his presidency. As Darren Walker and others muddied the waters on whether or not we should go after board members or not, we too questioned the tactic for entirely different reasons. Another failure was hidden within the success of Kanders' removal. This presented another critical moment for growth. Despite Kanders' removal, his company, Safariland, is still manufacturing and distributing tear gas and other tools of repression and death to be used against our movements. So what did his resignation accomplish? Of course, it shifted the landscape as to what is possible to question and achieve within the once seemingly impenetrable museum, but it does not stop our people from being tear gassed. So what is our next move? Here, the No New Jails campaign offers great insight into where to go next. No New Jail New York City's demand to the city is to divest in projects of state violence, such as an increase in policing and prisons, displacement and dispossession, and reinvest in building strong, healthy communities, such that we no longer need policing and jails. This plan doesn't focus on one bad donor. Instead, it recognizes that bad money is ubiquitous and capitalism must ultimately be dismantled. Additionally, the plan isn't simply concerned with the resignation of 1 or 2 board members. Its ultimate concern is the well-being of our communities. Anyone who is against the well-being of our communities is against us and will be held to account. Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation falls into this category. Even after Warren Kanders' resignation, he falls into this category. So what does it mean or look like to ask the wealthy to divest, invest, as opposed to simply demanding that they be removed from institutional boards? How do we make this bigger than the museum, especially given the fact that this has always been bigger than the museum for us? How do we reorient ourselves to the city in a major way? In September 2019, scholar, activist, and abolition elder Dr. Angela Y. Davis called for a protest of the Ford Foundation. So we took this opportunity to organize an action with No New Jails New York City in front of the institution on September 27, 2019. At first, the Ford Foundation security worked in tandem with NYPD in an attempt to keep us from protesting on the institution's property. We knew the cops could not arrest us on the Ford Foundation's private property unless Darren Walker risked his institution's liberal brand and gave them permission to do so. After we loudly and boldly asserted our rights, the police stepped back and we formed a circle and held space for a speak out. At one point, a few militant individuals showed their support from the inside by quickly creating a poster reading "No New Jails" and hanging it in the window facing us. On the other hand, some workers opposingly confronted us as they exited the building. One Black woman screamed and blamed the protesters for our own and continued enslavement. A typical "you should have pulled yourself up by your bootstraps" narrative. Needless to say, there's still so much more work to be done. Before I conclude my presentation, I want to shout out our decolonial formation back in New York City. As we prepare for civil unrest to finally break in the United States, it is crucial that we continue building these relationships of solidarity and kinship. For us, these relationships are the true successes of our movement. As I mentioned, we just hosted our 4th Anti-Columbus Day tour this past Monday, which mapped the American Museum of Natural History, Seneca Village, Central Park, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art as sites of struggles in our city. As we continue to think through our entangled positionalities in the web of settler colonization, the question remains, how do we walk separately and together toward a decolonial horizon? What does Black and Indigenous solidarity look like on Turtle Island? How does the struggle of decolonization relate to the abolition struggle? What about the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the displacement and dispossession of non-white settlers on this land? Our action was a land acknowledgement calling upon the multiple histories of the land, beginning with the Lenape peoples. We marched from site to site, highlighting the specificities and kinships between decolonization, abolition, anti-gentrification, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. Over 1,000 people marched through Upper Manhattan and Central Park, concluding in a series of teach-ins on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We were quite literally in the wealthy people's backyard. We didn't even go into the museum this year. It was no need. One question we raised in our article entitled "After Candor's Decolonization is the Way Forward" is whether or not museums are even salvageable given their deeply entrenched roots in the nation state. Unless the museum returns the land on which it rests, can it ever be decolonized? Does that not require the end of museums as we know it? I believe decolonization does require the end of museums as we know it, and until that moment happens, as the producers and gatekeepers of nation-state logic and culture, museums and other institutions will continue to be sites of struggles in our cities. Please connect with us on social media to stay updated on the work. As I said, this last action just happened on Monday, so this is the most up-to-date update I could give you. Also, please grab one of our publications. This is a photo of it. I'll have them on stage after Q&A. And this publication entitled Anemones, Centers Indigenous, Palestinian, and Black Liberation and Solidarity. There are over 20,000 of these in print. 7,000 of them are in my small-ass Brooklyn apartment, so please take as many as possible. I brought 100, that's all I could fit in my bag, to Sao Paulo with me to distribute. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. I also have stickers. Y'all got cop cars here? You might need to sticker it.
Obrigada, Mars, pela apresentação. Nós avançamos um pouquinho no tempo, mas eu vou ler algumas perguntas que chegaram do público. O movimento de Descolonize This Place é bastante diverso em sua composição, mas as bandeiras têm especificidades de acordo com as demandas de cada grupo. Como o movimento lida com isso? Quais são as estratégias para lutar junto? Vocês possuem alguma articulação com grupos de outros países?
That's a really great question. To retain the specificity of a struggle while also standing in solidarity with each other is very complicated. I think one thing to acknowledge is that this notion of unity, as opposed to to differentiate unity and solidarity, right? Unity is something that social justice platforms often use, right? We need every person, it's a numbers game. all black people on deck, when we know that there is no monolithic black person. There are class divides, there are gender divides, religion divides. And so given that, it's really important to understand that, to work in affinity with each other. We're all moving towards a common decolonial horizon, but all of our movements are completely different. Of course, there is different drama that arises in that, but it's always returning back to a decolonial framework to figure out what's to move next. Centering indigenous peoples, right? So how do we do that? Centering trans women, centering these different groups. And at the end of the day, because we all subscribe to a decolonial framework, things tend to work themselves out. That's one difference than just organizing based on identity, right? Because you can organize based on identity, but you all might not have the same political vision. So instead, organizing based on the shared political vision leaves room for all these different struggles to see themselves in the work and to move together. I hope that answers the question.
Sim. E uma pergunta, também uma curiosidade. Você consegue estimar quantas pessoas formam um grupo, mais ou menos? No todo?
Sorry, I'm such a loser. Okay, that's a really good question. So I should have probably stated, Decolonize This Place was founded and facilitated by, and is facilitated by MTL Plus Collective, and that's a group of about 10 of us. But as you see, our decolonial formation is over 30 to 40 groups. And each of those groups are community-centered, and they come with dozens of people. But when you see our larger actions, such as at the American Museum of Natural History for Indigenous Peoples Day, we're over 1,000 people. On the internet, we're over 55,000 people. So it really just depends on the place and what's happening. What's really important is that, and something that shifted in the city, is that no longer is it just the residents of Chinatown or just the residents of the South Bronx fighting anti-gentrification. We all show up for each other's struggles. And one of the turning points for me was definitely at a Chinatown rally where there were black people, brown people, Asian folks, indigenous folks, and the look on the police officers' faces, they were just they came up to us and they were like, "Why are all of you here?" And we're like, "'Cause you're displacing our friends, back the fuck up." And that was essentially the conversation. So yeah, we're a lot of people and we roll pretty deep.
Outra pergunta. As instituições culturais já conversaram com vocês? Atenderam às demandas levantadas pelo movimento? Como se dá essa conversa, se ela já aconteceu, e se vocês já tiveram alguma mudança ou demanda atingida ou alguma resposta, seja ela positiva ou negativa, de alguma instituição?
That's a really good question. So on one hand, you have institutions like the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum just refuses flat out to acknowledge anything. They're a mess. And then on the other hand, you have museums like the American Museum of Natural History. The American Museum of Natural History, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this, they love having conversations about future conversations to be had, to converse about. So they called us in a couple of times to talk about absolutely nothing, essentially to pat themselves on the back. Look at what we're doing. We've been working for the last 3,000 years to repatriate one item, this, that, and the third. And in fact, there was an image in the PowerPoint I had to take out for time, but the statue, all they did was add a plaque to the statue that essentially says, whereas some people find this to be racist, others find it to be a heroic grouping. Right? So, and then on the other hand, you have the Whitney Museum, which flat out was like Warren Kenders, he had to go, and so he resigned, he was pushed out. So it's a wide ranging of responses, but what's important is that after Warren Kenders resigned, the museum as this untouchable entity that was squashed. No longer do people think that we cannot hold them accountable. Now we understand that we actually have the power, especially because our tax dollars pay for those museums, a lot of them to exist, right? So this whole inside, outside of the institution binary does not exist. We're all inside of the institution because our tax money pays for it to survive. Therefore, it should be held accountable to us and our demands, and that's the way we're moving forward.
Isso, de alguma maneira, também me lembrou um pouco a fala da Jota Mombassa ontem, quando ela fala que o problema é estrutural, né? Ou seja, não adianta nada mudar apenas, incluir artistas ou atender essas demandas como as diferenças dos projetos, por exemplo, que o Brooklyn Museum tem, né, na sua programação, mas o papel que ele desempenha, por exemplo, na gentrificação daquela região, né, esses descompassos, essas contradições. E uma das questões também que apareceu, um dos pontos principais que apareceu na sua fala, da atuação do Decolonized Place, foi a questão da gentrificação, né? E isso é algo que as instituições, elas muitas vezes desempenham um papel muito forte nisso, e eu queria ouvir um pouco sobre como barrar, se existe uma maneira de, enfim, impedir com que essas coisas aconteçam. Acho que toda a sua fala se pautou um pouco nisso, mas se você poderia comentar um pouco também o papel da gentrificação nesse questionamento dessa estrutura da qual as instituições, enfim, colaboram.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it because there's so much to the anti-gentrification struggles going on right now. I mean, artists are usually the first wave of gentrifiers in neighborhoods, period. Like, I'm an artist. I have an MFA. I have to hold myself to account in that as well. That's a dope ringtone. So one thing is, like, we have a banner that says, like, out of the white box into the street, trying to mobilize artists and realizing their role in this. Because oftentimes, what is it, right? Like, you're underpaid. You're probably an adjunct professor at a university that doesn't give two shits about you. So you are looking to move to a neighborhood that has rent prices that you can afford because you probably have a family that you have to feed. That's what the individualized capitalist society does to each of us, right? And then in the process of doing so, now you feel guilty because you just displaced a long-term person of color residence from their house, which, by the way, they're a settler on stolen land to begin with. So the process can seem really daunting. One thing that we're currently doing, along with uniting gentrification struggles across the boroughs, is focusing specifically on the Department of City Planning, because a lot of this has to do with, like, rezoning, and rezoning is like really intricately related to the building of institutions. The Whitney Museum, for example, was not always in the meatpacking district. It was in the upper Manhattan with all the other white people where they go to their museums. But decades ago, I believe it was Mayor Bloomberg, he wanted to rezone the west side of Manhattan to make it into the perfect white settler playground, where he wanted to connect everything from Chelsea all the way up to Midtown, which is a waterfront property, through art, museums, shops, all of the typical things, green spaces, all of those things. So this actually started decades ago, a rezoning process. The Whitney knew about that process. In fact, some of their funders were advocates of that process, right? So it's not like they don't know. And they knew how, like, this is an age-old, equation, right? They knew that their presence was gonna cause this. So the question becomes, can those museums actually choose people over profit? But, like, can we expect them to? And who are on the boards of these museums? Real estate developers. I tell you, like, 5 out of 10 people on the boards of museums are real estate developers. If you're a real estate developer, why would you care about the black and brown people who you're displacing? So the question then really becomes, like, well, one, museum governance in a way, but also just, like, everything's really interconnected, and until we make those connections, gentrification as an isolated issue will never be solved. I kind of, like, talked around that a lot, but that's kind of where it's at right now. And also, I'd say one more thing on that, is it's very important to connect gentrification not as this new process, but as, like, this ongoing thing with settler colonization, and to understand that gentrifiers come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, right? I'm a gentrifier in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. I'm not from there, but I'm also not from Virginia, where I was born. So these are the questions that we really have to ask ourselves in thinking through this, because if we're saying anti-gentrification for black and brown people, but not return the land to indigenous peoples, then we're always gonna lose.
Bom, eu acho que eu vou encerrar por hoje as nossas apresentações. Eu gostaria de agradecer muito todo mundo que trabalhou nesse projeto, nesse evento. Gostaria de agradecer também as comunicadoras que vieram aqui hoje. e as tradutoras, o pessoal que trabalhou na gravação dessas falas, que vão estar disponíveis no YouTube depois do museu, na internet. E muito obrigada a todas, todos e todos. E é isso aí. Obrigada, gente. You distribute the publication. Quem quiser publicações do Decolonize Displace, é só aparecer aqui no palco e falar com a gente. Obrigada.